Before I get into this, I might as well give you my little preamble too, because as Norm said, you know, contextualizing yourself in these things is often a better way. Whoops. Got it. Thank you. To get to know each other and to actually not have what we say land in space. So I'm here speaking as an insider too. I am autistic and only recently have not discovered that. I think I've always known that, but I predate a lot of those diagnoses that people get nowadays, and so had to come to it late, like many women do, in understanding that about myself. So I am basically the kid that you might be thinking about right about now. And people say, well, you know, you look so normal. I get that all the time. What you didn't see is me as a kid. And what you don't see is what you don't see. There are things that you do see, and there are things that you don't see about my experience, my sensory experience, etc. And as a kid, I was one of those kids. In fact, I managed to catapult myself out of school by the time I was 15, because there was no place in the way that the school system operated for someone who learned like I learn. And kind of to put it mildly, a quirky learner, and my behaviors also were part and parcel of that. So this is a topic that I am particularly passionate about. Both of us are. So I'll bring you a little bit of that perspective as we go forward. So to the question, what do I do? Well, when I was doing my master's thesis, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Alfie Kohn's work. He's written a book called Punished by Rewards, where he looks at the whole punishment and reward system and says that actually using rewards is as problematic as using punishments, because it creates people who do this to get that. You know what I mean? And inadvertently wind up undervaluing the task that they're involved in because they're doing something to get something. So that's part of a longer story. If you haven't actually heard of Alfie, alfiekohn.org, wonderful stuff. Anyway, this is a story I've borrowed from Alfie, and I use it a lot. So here's the question. Oh, first of all, sorry, backtrack. So what we typically think we want when we're confronted with behavior that we're unsure about how to respond to is we think we want a recipe. But in fact, I think we all know there isn't one. And anyone who gives you a recipe, you should be profoundly, profoundly suspicious of. And I think you would be, right? You're going to look at it and say, not really. So what we need instead is a pantry. A whole lot of ideas and a whole lot of people to collaborate with. And that actually is why I went to the whole field of hostage negotiation. We are firm believers in cross-pollination. And again, like Norm said, when we go to the same people with the same questions, we are surprised when we get the same answers. So I'll get into that in a minute. But here's a question for you. Can you make people do what you want them to do? I got some no's and I got some people nodding their heads. So I think that as a question, you know, is it true? Can you get people to do what you want them to do? Well, here's the thing. If I were to say to you that I have armed guards posted at all of these doors, and I'm not going to let any one of you out of here before 7 o'clock tonight, or I'll shoot you, would you stay? Well, unless you have a death wish that you haven't disclosed to the rest of us, my guess is that you would stay, right? So if I apply the stick, yeah, I can make you do what I want you to do. Conversely, the carrot, if I told you that I had $5,000 for each one of you who stay here till 7, would you? Yeah, probably, yeah. Real enthusiasm on that. I'm sorry, I don't. So if I apply the carrot, I can get you to do what I want you to do. So here's the next question. Is it right? Is it ethical of me to try to get you to do what I want you to do? I'm seeing a lot of people shaking their heads, and I'm glad, because that's really a great ethical place to come from. But I gotta say to you that if we decided to open this up for a debate, we'd be finished, because the rest of the next 2 days would be spent discussing this. Is it ethical for me to grab my 2-year-old as she runs out into traffic? Yep. So again, you know, it depends, right? The great one-line answer to many things. It depends. But here's the question that we think is more interesting. Does it work? Does it work to make people do what you want them to do, even if you have all their best interests in mind? Well, in order to unpack that, I have to tell you a story, and again, it's not mine. It comes from a book called They Shoot Managers, Don't They? Great title, huh? So anyway, this guy, Terry Paulson, in this book, tells about an instance where he was actually in an airport, and he had to do something to change his ticket. But he was standing in line behind a guy who was going absolutely ballistic about some change in his travel plans. And he was yelling and pounding on the podium, and through the whole thing, this ticket agent was completely unflappable. He said, "Yes, sir, no, sir, I'll see what I can do, sir." And finally, the guy storms off, and Terry Paulson steps up to the podium and says, "You know, before we do anything about my ticket, I just need to ask you something." He says, "I'm writing a book on conflict processes, and I just watched what you did there, and I don't think I could have stayed as cool as you did. What is your secret?" And the guy said, "Well, it's really very simple, sir. You see that guy?" And you could. He was running down the jetway. "He's on his way to Cincinnati. His bags are going to Japan." So if you decide you want to utilize coercion to get somebody to do what you want them to do, expect to spend a lot of time on the phone to Japan inquiring about the location of your bags, right? People will subvert your efforts to do this stuff. Oh, I forgot your slide. I did. Yes, my slide guru put this one in so you can see the bags going off to Japan. All right, so what do you do if coercion isn't the way to go? Well, you know, Henry Mencken said every complex problem has a simple solution, and it's invariably wrong. So no, there are no simple solutions to any of this. There are only ideas, and there are only collaborations. One of the things that I would caution you about in the beginnings and in your pursuit of positive behavioral supports is don't get stuck on a methodology. Don't let it be about that. Don't let it be about that. We've seen all too often in North America, I don't know how it's playing out here in schools, where the drive to collect data supersedes the rest of what's going on. Yeah, so that would be my caution. So, before I do this, just tell you a little bit about how this research came to be. I have spent, and Norm, many, many years talking with educators, human service professionals, etc., around the whole issue of behavior. And as I said, it's something that we're both really passionate about. And routinely we would hear the same thing from people. We would hear, "I don't have time to create relationships," because we talk a lot about that, about relationship as the core to this whole thing. "I don't have time to create relationships," and the second part would be, "and you don't know the people I'm supporting," right? So having got quite tired of hearing that, and having my academic background in conflict processes, I thought, well, let's go someplace else to have this conversation. And the reason I got there was a friend of ours who is very involved in school safety and also trained as a hostage negotiator out of Georgia, once said something to me many, many, many years ago that just stuck. He said, and this was about teachers, but I think we can extrapolate a bit. He said, "Educators routinely do things to confront students in ways that hostage negotiators would never dream of doing." And I went, yeah, I watch TV. I've seen the SWAT team and the Kevlar vests and the smoke bombs and the throw phones and the authoritarian commands. Well, guess what? What I found out when I began to interview, and I interviewed negotiators from all over North America, the guy who negotiated the Lufthansa hijacking, the Headingley prison riots. What I found is that they use the SWAT team, despite what you see on TV, in less than 1% of the time. The rest of the time, it's all based on communication. Debbie, I think you were talking about, breathe, take a breath. One of the things I learned from negotiators is they come from an action-oriented imperative, right? The action imperative, you got to do something every minute. They call what you described dynamic inactivity. And they said sometimes doing nothing is better than doing something. What I'd like you to know about negotiators is that they are successful in de-escalating some of the most upset, distraught people you could ever imagine, more than 90% of the time. The negotiators I talked to said that's the literature. It's closer to 95% in my experience. We do not have statistics like that anywhere. And it's all based on communication and listening. listening and listening. But here's the thing that really got me, and I'm going to cut to the chase. There's a lot of things I learned, but this was the big one. They said that the most important thing was to be able to shift your narrative of who a person is. What is the story you are telling yourself when someone is doing something? Right? And I'm not just talking about let's tell your story. I'm talking about narrative in a broader way. Narrative as the larger societal stories that influence what we think and how we act, and our family stories, our cultural stories. Who else is watching? That got talked about this morning. You know, who's watching and how are we influenced by that? All of those stories play into how we see the person in front of us. And I want to give you an example of that. I want to talk about this whole idea of narratives just for a couple of minutes. So narratives are the way we construct meaning in our lives, right? We have to have narratives. We have narratives to make sense out of the world. So we've got narratives about who men are, who women are, what children should do, you know, what it means to go to school, what it means to go to work. We have narratives for absolutely everything. Now, if we only had one single narrative, that would be easy, right? But we have competing narratives. So, you know, we have narratives about what it, well, I'll give you an example. I was walking past an elementary school the other day, and it had a quote on a plaque. And it said, "The purpose of education is not knowledge, but action." Google that. Just go Google that, and you'll see, just Google the front part of it. The purpose of education is. And you'll find as many narratives as there are people about what education is supposed to be. So we have many competing narratives. And we construct those based on our experiences. You with me so far? Okay, everything okay? Okay, I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to put 3 lines up here on this screen. And when you know what the meaning of these 3 lines is, I want you to put up your hand. Don't say anything. Just put up your hand, okay? Here it goes.
Can you write them out, please?
Can I what?
Can you write them out?
Can I write them out? No. They aren't words. They're just 3 lines. I'm sorry about that. Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. You can't, Susan. You already know this. 5. All right, somebody. What is this?
Letter E.
The letter E. The rest of you are going letter E, letter E, letter E. Let me help you out. There you go. It's the letter E, right? Now, where is that letter E, actually? Is that letter E up on the screen? If it were, we'd all have known that it was there right away. No, that letter E exists somewhere between this screen and your brain. And you needed to find a way to make sense out of it before you understood what that was, right? And that's the way we construct stories. Another example. All right. I want to talk about relocating the problem, which is something that Norm and I talk about a lot. Where do we see the problem of behavior? Okay. How many pillars do you see? Okay, I'm hearing 3. Anybody for 2? Well, I'm going to put to you that you're all right. It depends on where you look. So if I do this, you see that there are 2 square pillars, right? But on the other hand, if I do this, you see 3 round pillars. So it all depends on where you look. Now suppose I was to do something here. It's just to isolate a little square in the middle of this and remove the bottom part. And basically say to you, what is the meaning of that square? Well, you know, if that square was all by itself on the screen in the way that it was supposed to be, but the PowerPoint screwed up, you would probably say that has no meaning, and you'd be correct. But the meaning it gains is dependent on the story we tell around it. So, if I put it here, you can see that it is a rectangle with 2 square columns on each side. But if I do this, you'll see that it's a round pillar with space on either side, right? So what you see will be dependent on the story you tell around it. So why don't we, for a moment, think about putting behavior into that rectangle? So for example, here's some examples of behavior. Stimming, lack of eye contact. These are things that people think are behaviors. Autistic people do not. And by the way, just a brief thing, I call myself an autistic person, not a person with autism. It's not to be offensive to any of you who like person first language, but in the neurodiversity movement, we prefer identity first language. As Ari Ne'eman says, it's not like luggage. You can't check it at the door. So, echolalia, intense focus on a topic, being injurious to yourself or others. That's one that we're familiar with, right? So what if we put that in there? Well, how we see those things will depend on the story that we tell around it. So if we tell a story that locates that problem firmly within that person, then we're going to look at it as evidence of an intellectual disability, perhaps, as abnormal behavior, perhaps, as dysfunctional social skills. So the problem is in the person. You with me? However, if we look at this in a relational way, if we look at it between the person and their environment and the people who are in that environment, and we see that behavior is created relationally and doesn't just come from a vacuum, then what we may see are important and needed coping strategies, right? Ways of dysregulating and expressions perhaps of anxiety or stress. Okay? So in the one sense, when we're looking at behavior, if we see it as the top, the person is seen as the problem. If we see it in the bottom, the problem is the problem. And this basically detaches us from the judgment. And that's what negotiators said they had to do most of anything, is detach judgment. They said, you know, in your line of work or in your families, if you engage in a little judgmentalism, which is, you know, honestly, it's kind of understandable, it maybe isn't the worst thing in the world. In our line of work, we know that judgment leaks into what you do, whether you think it does or not. And when we do that, if we don't change our narrative of who a person is, people die. So it's really critical for us. So which story do we believe here? Person's a problem or the problem is a problem? So if we think the person is a problem, then our narrative is going to be about smarten up. Stop doing that. And that's a narrative of correction. If we understand that the problem is the problem, it's a narrative of what's up, right? And then it's a narrative of curiosity. And that's what negotiators said. First of all, they changed their view of the person. Rather than that jerk in the bank with the sawed-off shotgun and the 3 hostages, it becomes just a person in a bad place. That's it. And that allowed them then to start from there and begin listening. The first question that a hostage negotiator asks a hostage taker or a barricaded person is, so how did we get here today? What happened to bring us here? Great question for us, don't you think? So, what was my next slide here? Okay, so just quickly, a little story about this. Norm and I were called in to work with a school district in a place that shall remain nameless, where they were having quite a lot of difficulty in their school. One of the things that we do a lot of is talk about belonging and creating a sense of belonging in schools. And this school principal had heard us do a presentation, and she wanted us to come in and help create a sense of belonging in her school. So we went, and the way that it worked is Norm sometimes will do school assemblies. So he did a morning school assembly. It was in a middle school. And then we did an in-service session on a lot of this stuff with the teachers. And then in the evening, there was going to be a parent session for the community, etc. So anyway, Norm finishes his school assembly. And as we're walking out of the auditorium, the principal's with us, and she spots this little kid walking with a teacher. And she says, Leo, is this a little kid, maybe 7 or something, Hispanic kid. She says, Leo, come over here and meet Mr. Norman. And she says to him, now Leo, you've been having a lot of trouble in school. And you just heard Mr. Norman talk about, you know, some of the things around him and his disability. So Leo, you know, I think you could really do a lot better, and you should be listening to Mr. Norman. Meanwhile, Norm and I are going, please, let some teleportic thing drop from the ceiling and get us out of here fast. Please don't do this in our name. But anyway, she's on a roll, and I have to say she's very well-intentioned, a lovely person, if a bit misguided on this one. Anyway, so she says, now Leo, you'll do better now that you've heard this, right? And Leo goes, okay. And she sends him off. So we go do our thing in the afternoon, and then in the evening we come back, and we're setting up, and the principal comes up to us. Yep.
In the afternoon, we specifically did this.
Yes, we talked about this. And so in the evening, we're setting up, and the principal comes to us, and she's crying. And we said, uh-oh, was it something we did? And she said, no. I need to tell you something. I thought about what you said, and I thought about Leo. And I went back and I found him, and I brought him into the classroom, and I sat down, knee to knee, eye to eye, and I said, Leo, what's up? She said, he told me. She said, he said that about a month and a half ago, his mother had left the family after a very big fight with his father, and about 2 weeks ago, she had come back, and she told the kids that they would never see her anymore. And he said, now I sit and look at the wall and think about how I'm never going to see my mommy. She said, I didn't know. It was the context, right? So it's a powerful change of narrative from smarten up to what's up. And it requires that shift in perspective. So what I want to do is help just shift that perspective very quickly by introducing you to Emily Titan. Emily is a very good friend of ours. She's also autistic and comes from Rhode Island, and she's just going to talk a little bit about her experience of autism.
Emily, to start off with, many people assume that autism is a disease that needs to be cured. I know one of the basic principles of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is autism isn't deficiency, it's neurodiversity. Could you talk about that?
Sure. There's this belief, and there still is with some people, that autistic people need to be cured, that we're broken and we need to be fixed, and we're in our own little worlds and all this. And that's actually not true, at least to us. We believe that it's just another way to be. A lot of the thinking has been geared towards fixing or working on normalization, making us undistinguishable from our peers, our non-autistic peers. And so that, the assumption there is that we have to be like everybody else, that there's something wrong with the way we are and the way we think. And so they're trying to take Macs and make them into Windows, going back to the metaphor. And you can't really do that without breaking the Macintosh. So although we can do, there are emulation programs for Windows on the Macintosh, and we can emulate a non-autistic person to an extent, but it's extremely taxing on us, and it really takes a lot of our energy, and it's very hard to do. And there's something called the autistic crash that we sometimes talk about, and that happens when you've been forced to be normal for such a long time, and then you get to a point where you just can't do it anymore, and you kind of fall down emotionally and mentally, and you get really depressed and stuff. And that's why there are some, papers that went around that I read when I was younger that, why do people regress in their 20s and 30s? And I think that happens when we reach that point. So that's one reason, is that making us normal, trying to make us normal, is actually really, really, really bad for us and painful.
Another narrative, another perspective. And on that note, I think I will... Oh yeah, further resources, quickly. Sorry, quickly. Have I got 2 minutes? Awesome, I can't believe I actually did that in the time. All right, so if you want to have a look at more stuff around the neurodiversity movement, first of all, anybody seen Steve Silverman's brand new book, Neurotribes? No, you must. It's number 8 on the New York Times bestseller list. And if you want to know about the history of autism and how it got pathologized, and then learn about the neurodiversity movement, it's 500 pages, and it's a page turner. It's awesome. Anyway, there's the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network out of the U.S. And there are multiple blogs. The Autistic Hoya, which is our friend Lydia Brown, up-and-coming activist in the neurodiversity community. She's studying law now. They, I should say. She has a they pronoun. Let's see. Emma's Hope book. Ariane Zurcher and her daughter, Emma Zurcher-Long, share this blog. Emma is autistic and is 14 now. Ask an Autistic. This is our friend Amethyst from Vancouver. Really, really comprehensive blog on what is stimming and all kinds of other things. Books, Ito in Autism Land, I Am Intelligent, our friends Peyton Goddard and her mom Diane, and a very hilariously wonderful book called I Might Be You by Barb Rettenbach. Barb runs something called the Loud Mute Radio. Barb doesn't speak. Picture it. It's awesome. So, also, Playful Approaches to Serious Problems. This is David Epstein from New Zealand. Lost at School, which is Ross Green. It's a great book. So, finally, if we can look at others with curiosity rather than judgment, then we will discover the tenderness within ourselves. So thank you. And may I show you a neuro-friendly way to do applause, which is also used in the deaf community if you've never seen it? It's this. Thank you.